Oh, so thank you, Sarah, for coming to talk with me. This is going to be a bit of a different conversation because hopefully I know some of your answers to these questions. But so I've got a range of questions I'm going to ask you about, but it's a conversation rather than an interrogation, and we can just kick off and see where we get to.
Sounds good.
First of all, let's hear a bit about what sort of psychologist you are and what sort of work you do day to day.
Yeah, sure. So I am a sport and exercise psychologist. So I work with primarily with a focus on athlete groups and into high performing sport environments, working one to one not only with athletes but with coaches, MDT staff, and those that are involved in professional sport mainly, which I'm very privileged and lucky that these days that would be the majority of my clients.
And do you have particular sports that you work into, or is it?
Yeah.
I'm saying this like I don't know. I know it's a range, but tell us what the range is.
So a massive range when I first qualified, a huge range of sports from British Real Tennis Association. I mean, who knew that was a
Real
sport?
tennis,
Yes, absolutely.
not pretend.
No, Henry VIII. So one of my first applied jobs as a sports psychologist, I supported the British Real Tennis Association, which was fascinating. So I had to learn all about the sport, and it's a very old traditional sport. From that to golf, to hockey, equestrianism. I've turned up to remember turning up to a field many years ago in somewhere in the middle of Sussex, to a hut where I delivered and worked with referees, football referees. So a range of sports from individual. I've worked with quite a few pole vaulters over the years. But if I were to talk about the bulk of my 15 years applied work as a sports psychologist in terms of the sport that I've worked most predominantly in, it would be football, professional football across the men's game and across the women's game.
Awesome. And what made you want to be a psychologist? Where did that journey start for you?
That journey started where I think so many journeys start with a little bit of me search um, rather than research. So I'm on career number two out of, and I always say I don't know how many. So my journey as a sports psychologist started with my own relationship with sport. So I'm a retired athlete, played to a very high level hockey, and played county cricket and numerous sports. So therefore, of course, the profession I went into originally was PE teaching, so that I could have that profession and play sport at the same time. But I'd always been fascinated by human behaviour and fascinated by my own psychology, particularly in and around having given up individual sports in my late teens because the pressure of throwing a javelin and being on my own, the pressure of playing tennis, I vividly remember I struggled to cope, and I just had a real physiological and mental, psychological reaction to those sports. So I just said, no, I'm stopping those, and stuck with team sports. The fascination around my own sort of inability, if you like, to step up in big match moments. Brilliant training player, but big match moments, and I never turned up. So that had always piqued my interest. And then in my late 20s, I suffered burnout, chronic fatigue disease. So I had to give up sport and I had to give up teaching, my career, which was slightly difficult and led to all sorts of inner reflection on athletic identity and who I was and my value in the world, which led to my interest in psychology and sports psychology. It enabled me to do a master's in sports psychology and just study a little further with an aim, I thought, to go back to teaching afterwards. But I loved it so much. I was so passionate about it that I just thought, wow, how do I do this for a living? And so then that was that. I started my training process, trained for 3 years, supervised experience, through the old British Association of Sport and Exercise Scientists, BASES, which is now of course CASES, which then of course 3 years ago I was able to get my HCPC registration finally because they opened the door up for that. And yeah, there we are. Something like
So
that.
to begin with, so it wasn't the plan to necessarily become a psychologist. It was studying psychology
Mm,
because you were interested.
yeah.
I didn't realize how interested.
Yes, but I hadn't realized. Yeah, I just was So I absolutely loved it. And as someone that would be a self-proclaimed, um, I guess, average grader academically my whole life. Somebody that would work really, really hard, but never really gelled particularly well with academics. When I went back I was in my late 20s, early 30s, I suppose, to do my master's, I suddenly, because I was so interested in it, was actually finding it kind of easy, enjoyable, getting great grades, going, "Oh, okay, so I'm not stupid. This is good to know." Um, and
Yes,
then I think also, no matter what had come of my 3 year supervision period, whether I had then carried on as a sports psychologist or gone back into teaching, or it was the most powerful kind of human development experience I could ever have, in terms of being introduced to therapy, to having counselling, to being supervised, and doing the inner work on myself. No matter what had come of that, was just the most powerful thing that I think I could have ever done.
Did it surprise you how much you learned about yourself
Oh,
during that process?
yeah, absolutely. Both one of the most challenging yet rewarding processes ever. And I'm always really open. I'm always probably too open about, when I was an athlete, um, I don't know, 20 years ago, if someone had said to me, "Oh, go and work with a sports psychologist," I'm always very honest, and I say I would have said absolutely not. What do you mean? There's nothing wrong with me. What do you mean work with a psychologist? I'm fine. That real sort of, physically fine, I'm fine, we're all fine. And I think that was very much the environment and the kind of high performance environment that I'd experienced and I'd always been within, both in my teaching career in very male dominated sport departments and on a hockey pitch. Um, and so the irony that actually, this is what I do for a living, and, I did so much work on myself, is not lost on me.
But I guess we need to be shown, don't we?
Mm,
Um,
yeah,
that you were young, and of course you would be influenced by the norms within your environment.
yeah.
Um,
Mm.
I'm going off piste here. I'm going away from the questions I've got in front of me. But do you think that's changing? Do you think if you were, let's say, a 20-year-old hockey player now, do you think that environment would be different?
Yeah, I think there have been massive, since I've been practicing, there have been huge leaps forward in terms of, not just the domain of sports psychology, but psychology in general, the kind of the sociocultural view of it, being less about there's a problem, something wrong with you, and more about actually, a maintenance and an exploration of our own psychology and what's going on for us, being something that is no different really to physically being fit, but maybe still going to the gym because you want to
Yes.
maintain that and explore your own body. So I think there have been some, certainly across the sports I've worked in, there's been a real shift in terms of the way in which sports psychology is viewed, with a long way to go, caveat, definitely. But yeah, it's viewed more positively now than perhaps in the past, and far more integrated as part and parcel of athletic development, for those that are struggling, of course, but not just for those that are struggling.
Yeah. I think that's something we've talked about before, isn't it? That some people are struggling and they need help to be able to kind of function day to day. And then there's also, if people are functioning, well, can they function even better?
Absolutely.
Um, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, one of my questions I'm going to be asking everybody is, what does a typical day look like? Now, I already know that you would just laugh at me for asking that.
Mhm.
So, and you sort of said before that sometimes you're working one to one with athletes, sometimes you're working one to one with coaches. So, if we kind of zoom out from a typical day, because I know you're going to tell me that there isn't such a thing for you, um, if we
Not
think if we think about a typical month,
Yeah.
what might be some of the things that you find yourself doing across
Yeah.
that month?
Oh, a really good question. As somebody that runs her own business now, and I'm in private practice rather than working solely full time for one badge club organization, for me now, a typical month would be working across multiple contracts. So a typical month would involve a mix of one-to-one delivery, So you're more, I guess, traditional sports psychology, if you like. Although I do very limited athlete-facing work these days, it's predominantly coaches and staff that work within sport. So there would be a mix of that. There would be a mix of group delivery, so a mix of team delivery, either online or face-to-face into certain contracts. There'd be a little bit of psychoeducation. So I have a lovely golf contract where I work with some very talented teenage golfers. So that would be sort of a little bit of a mixture of psychoeducation, one-to-one, and getting out on the course, doing team delivery with them. I would have a contract where I work with parents of talented athletes. So a typical month would always involve working into parent groups. It would also involve some corporate work using the lessons from high performance sport as a sports psychologist with CEOs and executives. So I'd do some one-to-one leadership development work with Amazon executives. Not the jungle, as somebody asked me the other day, but so it would be, so a month would be, really different. If I'm looking this way, it's because actually I have a list of sort of the contracts I have and the type of work I do. Mixed into that would be some supervision of aspiring young sports psychologists. So myself and a colleague have a supervision group. So there would be the paying it forward piece, if you like, always as part of my work. Yeah, a few things.
Yeah.
To
Could
sum
you pull out which are the ones that you enjoy the most?
I absolutely could. I probably, yeah, I could. I think, and actually, since I've been in private practice, every Christmas I do a head heart wallet. So I do a little bit of a head heart wallet process whereby I rate all my contracts based on out of 10 for my own head, my heart, the passion of how much I enjoy it or not, and my wallet does keep the roof over my head. And often the contract with the lowest score, I will always explore as to whether I'm giving the best to it, whether it gets the best from me, whether it's right. And if I think about what's always coming out on top is it's people facing one-to-one, which is shifted slightly, one-to-one delivery of work with football coaches.
Okay. And
Really.
that work with coaches, again, I can imagine you can tell me it's really varied. It, if you were to think about how much was perhaps well-being, how much was performance, how much was kind of skill development, what would be some of the most kind of common themes in that work?
I think a really common theme coming out is a space for like self-development, self-awareness, like who you are is how you coach, who we are is how we might show up. And so it's that, I guess, not dissimilar to the work that I had experienced when I was training in terms of, to understand who I am in order to do this role as a psychologist being so important. I think it's not just important as a psychologist, I think it's important in so many roles, and really important for coaches. And yet in their training, so many coaches, it's about X's and O's, it's about on the pitch, it's about the world out here. But actually it's how do I happen to the work rather than how does the work happen to me? And so much of my conversation is supporting to understand how they happen to the work due to, who they are, their own lived experiences, values, their beliefs, the way in which they view the world, and to provide a space for them to figure some of that stuff out, to then layer that into support performance, because there's a performance piece here. But yeah, very often there'll be a real mix of, particularly in football coaching, there'll be a real mix of working with coaches on well-being, and understanding self-awareness to then support others and do the job on the pitch.
That sounds brilliant. I often think about how lucky we are as psychologists to have clinical supervision, to have reflective practice spaces where, it's encouraged, isn't it, that we reflect on who we are and how we're impacting our work, how our work's impacting us. And you're just reminding me of how frequently I think everyone could benefit from that. And I can imagine, football coaches, it can seem like a very technical, tactical role, but the importance of relationships and connection, and values, and it's it's humans, isn't it? So that piece around, yeah, who am I? What am I bringing? That sounds really impactful and therefore a really nice thing to be doing.
Yeah, there's always also a big piece around stress and pressure and threat responses.
Yeah,
But very often they're in environments that are fast-paced, volatile, ever-changing. Um, and so again, a space to help them manage that, and build a relationship with the transitions that have been and those that are yet to come.
yeah, yeah. What are the elements of your role that you find the most challenging?
Administration. I yes, I'm definitely a doer. Like I'm in my element when I'm people facing or connecting with people, clients, groups. So in terms of making sure that I'm up to date on my notes, making sure that the basic competencies of registration to be a psychologist are GDPR, easy for me to say,
I
GDPR,
know.
making sure that I'm abreast on all of that. I find challenging, just because for me it's not as fun as when I'm, got the client in front of me. Um,
Yeah,
I also find it challenging to ensure that whilst I have a real bias and I recognise this for applied work, there's also a challenge in there to ensure that I'm up to date on the latest research, and up to date on my own skill development and my own professional development. So I think that's always going to be a challenge.
yeah. And do you, how do you manage that? I'm thinking both the sort of week to week admin as well as the sort of perhaps longer term planning around the CPD, the continuing professional development. Um, have you developed particular kind of systems or, again, particularly working for yourself? How do you manage that?
With some difficulty, with some periods where I think I'm absolutely smashing it, and some periods where I think, oh my goodness, like I really need to like sort this out and make sure I book onto that webinar or just do something other than be the client facing sort of deliverer of the work, if you like. So I would manage it now by ensuring that there's time and space not across every week but across every month, because I find for me it works out better if I can map it across a month and just every month know that I've got a half day, couple of hours, to either and again this supervision, ensure that that I'm reading research, rather than just working with clients, because otherwise I won't get any better.
Yeah, I'm stealing that idea, looking at that every month. Yeah,
And I think there's also a recognition for me as well that it doesn't have to be the big rocks, that actually CPD and continuing supervision doesn't have to be, one day out of every week, or it's only valuable if I do it for 4 hours. Actually, short, sharp hits. I get, I'm actually coining this term on this call. Okay, you can copyright it if you like, but it's almost like CPD kind of snacking,
mm,
you know research snacking just here and there, just making sure that,
yeah,
actually instead of skipping over everything, there are moments where I don't skip over it, I actually read it, and I actually like
yes.
that might impact my practice.
Yeah, I really relate to that. I was on a training course today, and by lunchtime, my concentration was gone. I really struggled then with the rest of the day, and I've noticed before if I might watch a TED talk, I might do something like 20 minutes, and I'm often surprised how much I get out of that.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. Yeah, and if we can look at it that way, I find then there's more chance that I'll actually do it.
yeah, yeah, more likely to do it, and then also I think more likely to use it because then we've got maybe a couple of key ideas that we're going to work with, rather than got a whole day's worth of ideas to try and incorporate into how we work.
100%. This sense of nudge psychology, this sense of small bite size manageable actions and things, that's what creates long-term behavior change, anyway, doesn't it? I mean,
Absolutely. Yeah.
onto every single word of a course that lasts 8 hours, because we just simply can't, we don't have capacity for it. I don't.
Yeah. No, no, I don't either. How have your views on psychology evolved as you've become more experienced and learnt more about it?
I'd say I don't think I realized how big a part of who I am would become how I function as a psychologist, and in terms of like the philosophical standpoint, my style as a practitioner. Like my views coming into training as a sports psychologist, 15 years ago, um, and certainly off the back of my MSc, was very much like, this seems like it's about mental skills training, and just mental skills and techniques, and it never really sat or landed with my values and what I believe in. And it was my supervisor that was one of the very first, and very rare back then, to be um, very much embedded in Gestalt and humanistic therapy as
Right.
her way in which she then worked as an applied sports psychologist. And I know that, you know, my views on psychology were massively influenced by her. Um, but that was also because they fitted what I truly believe in terms of athletes at first, in terms of, performance being important, but actually well-being underpinning performance. We take the whole person. And over the years, my views have become far more integrative, and my views have become far more, actually, I guess I'd like to think that I've built enough skills that I can flex and adapt to whatever a client might bring me. And so my
Yeah.
views have become less rigid, probably. Um, yeah, what a brilliant question. You're really getting me to reflect here. I knew you would. That's not the first time for anyone watching.
I mean, it's making me reflect as well. Yeah, it's early days in having these conversations. I've only had a couple so far, but I'm
Yeah,
finding them super helpful, really thought provoking, let alone what anyone else thinks.
mm,
Um,
for sure. I
what's
can't believe
something?
just
Sorry.
sorry, appreciate I just interrupted you. My views on sports psychology as a profession
Hmm.
have changed over the last 15 years, not favorably.
Go
It's
on.
rare that I meet a client or an organization who have had a positive experience with a sports psychologist. Now there are, and I have my own peer network. There are some absolute rock stars out there, some brilliant sports psychs doing some great work. However, broadly speaking, I think there's a problem with the profession. And I think the fact that we have so many mindset gurus, for example, working at the top end of professional sport that aren't qualified sports psychologists, I don't think we should solely be looking at that being the problem of sport, not knowing, what a psychologist is or isn't. I think there's a piece in here around what exactly as a profession are we doing to really ensure that we show what a good sports psychologist can and can't do, the value that they add, um, beyond some of the perception out there or some of the negative experiences that people have had. And I think there's a piece in there where we need, as a profession, to really hold the mirror up to ourselves. And I don't think that it's being done particularly well. And I'd like to hope that that is going to shift over some years to come. But I definitely, um, yeah, I definitely don't always feel proud of sometimes being a sports psychologist, for some of the negative comments that I hear, and some of what the perception is out there.
And just to be really clear, obviously, please don't name anybody. Please don't go super specific in that way. Um, but to be a little bit more specific about some of those sort of unhelpful experiences that people have had, what sort of things have they reported to you?
So things such as so athletes, for example, that I've worked with in the past, and building a relationship, and I vividly remember, several of them have said, but obviously everything I say to you is going to go straight back to the coach, or it's going to go straight back to, well, you'll just tell, and then it'll impact selection, or whatever it might be, or the last psychologist I worked with, told X, Y, Z, everything that we talked about, things that I can't even, I struggle to get my head around, how professional.
Yeah, yeah.
Our job. This is confidentiality is the like it's the absolute paramount. Stories of I vividly remember being at a conference. It was a Premier League conference for player care back, I don't know, maybe 2016, 17. And the role of player care is, as you may or may not know, is fairly big in football. It's an unregulated role. So, you know, anybody with any sorts of qualifications generally will have those roles. But I remember being in this conference, and the lady that was speaking to all the academy managers of all the academies in, you know, football academies in the country at the time. I remember her standing on the stage and saying, essentially, she was saying player care in, sports psych out. She said, because of course, you know, sports psychs can't be trusted because they just come in and, you know, the athlete, the player will come and talk to them, and then everybody knows about it 5 minutes later that that athlete, that player has a problem. So, which is why we want to bring player care into. And it's really, as you can imagine, it's really stuck with me.
Yes.
There have been numerous occasions where, and of course, as a practicing ethical sports psychologist,
Mm.
doing the work in the right way. Um, I've heard too many examples of that. Hence, there is still a fight to get sports psychology into quite a lot of performance spaces across multiple sports, not absolutely not just football. So the landscape's shifting, but it's not always shifting in the direction we might want it to.
And of course, it's so difficult, isn't it? If someone's had a bad experience, it's going to be so much harder for them to talk to you again, for them to trust you, that even if they will speak to you enough for you to explain who you would share information with, what you would share, what you wouldn't share, um,
Mm.
it's one thing for you to be able to say it, and quite another again for them to trust you and take that chance.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where I think, you know, it would be really easy to blame everyone else, but I think as a profession we need to keep holding the mirror up to ourselves, keep ensuring that we have really well supervised training routes that, you know, and again, much like you know, you're the expert in the clinical space, but I imagine the variety and the difference in quality from supervisor to supervisor, from, you know, there is always going to be a difference in terms of the experience that the trainee might have. But I think it's really important that sports psychology has some of the more regulated boundaries around training and supervision, that are more aligned with what you would experience if you're training to be a clinical psychologist. So I got lucky in terms of having a supervisor that absolutely insisted on me, you know, going through therapy and ensuring I did that piece of work as part of my training. But that wouldn't be the norm. Even now, it's not the
Yeah.
and I think there are things like that where we have a lot as a profession that we can still develop and learn from, and a lot's being done to head it in a good
Mm.
direction by the BPS, by KCs, by however, I think we can really pull on some of the, you know, the training routes for occupational psychology, for clinical psychology, for other.
Yeah. My sense of it compared to some of the other training routes is it's a much more kind of hands off. Um, Definitely compared to clinical training, you guys have a lot more free reign, a lot more potential to sort of go
Mhm.
out there and
Mhm.
muddle along. And I don't mean this disrespectfully at all, but sort of make things up as you go along. And of course, it's tricky, isn't it? When you're new to something, you don't know what you don't know, and we can get super excited. Oh, I've done some training. I can't wait to put it into practice.
Mhm. But
And you're right. You know, we need that really careful supervision, don't we, where we can then reflect on, rather than just getting carried away delivering this new piece of training that I'm super excited about. You know, I might need someone to rein me in a little bit and help me to think about what kind of systems and setups do I need around that, and what are the things that could maybe go wrong if I
absolutely.
just go for it too gung ho.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, I think so. And I think there are some, you know, and I certainly know of some brilliant supervisors out there in the sports psych space, that ensure their supervisees are well supervised when they go into their first one-to-one work. You know, when they go and do any sort of applied work, you know, really set them up and provide that space for the supervisee to be able to explore, reflect, you know, think about how that was. But it's not necessarily the norm in the same way that it might be across other other psychological other areas. Yeah, I think there's still some work to be done there, because of course
Yeah.
we do all the qualifications in the world, and this also worries me that we would have um, graduates coming out of MScs in sports psychology going, right, I'm a sports psychologist now. Off I go to do some work. I mean, like, you can do a master's in English literature. Doesn't make you an English literature teacher. Like, it doesn't give you the skills that are needed to be able to
Mm.
work one to one with a client. That comes through supervision and training.
Yeah.
That doesn't, in my experience, come from your postgrad. That's where we learn the theoretical underpinnings of everything that we do, but that is very different to the skills needed to relate, to listen,
Yeah.
and to
Yeah.
work with that human in front of us. That's a whole different ball game. And that's
Yeah.
what we should be setting up our sports psychologists for.
You've you've made me think of an analogy there. Tell me if you think this fits or doesn't fit. Of perhaps the MSc is like learning the theory of driving, and
Yes.
then the supervised practice is actually getting behind the wheel, um,
Nice.
trying out what you've learned.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Because, the theory is important. We will have to go through that. But yeah, we then need to learn how to work, how to listen,
Yeah.
how to understand ourself and how we happen to the work to ensure that we are working well with that client in front of us, and when we're not, and how that might play out, and how do we manage that, and when do we refer on. And obviously we know that's a huge part of a sports psychologist's role, is to be able to be comfortable. And all sports psychologists will have different levels with this in terms of working with clinical symptoms, and at what point they refer, and how they might spot them. But it's vital that they are really, really confident to be able to understand where our skill set starts and stops for support,
Yeah.
because we're not clinically trained.
Yeah. I feel like we could talk probably all evening about where else the profession could go. But in summary, the changes that you would want to bring in would be around the profession supporting itself to be more accountable, um, really reflecting on how it's perceived, and then targeting some of those areas, some of those misconceptions that perhaps need addressing.
Mm.
Really sort of making sure that supervised practice is as supervised as it needs to be. Um, is there anything else that you think the profession could do more of, less of, and how you're seeing it changing over time, if you sort of predict what the next 10 or 20 years might look like?
Goodness. I think I'm actually excited. I'm actually excited for the next 10 or 20 years, because, certainly if I think about the group of supervisees that my colleague and I have, and I think about some of the early applied work that they're starting to do, I'm excited for the profession. It makes me really excited that there's going to be some brilliant practitioners out there doing some really great work. And likewise, some of my other friends that would supervise, or some of the early careers practitioners coming through, like, we've got some fantastic practitioners. So I think there's lots being done well, and I think
Mm-hmm.
in terms of what the next 20 years will be like, it's starting to shift, and I'm sure it will shift more in terms of this sense of the emergence of more and more pracademics, more and more.
Academics. So you
Yeah.
introduced me to the term Mesearch, now pracademics.
Academic, so those that have a foot in the applied world whilst also researching, which is fantastic, because that's how we make the research come alive, and it properly informs
Yeah.
practice, because there's a sense of what it is to be on the ground, boots on the ground, from an applied point of view. So I think we're going to see a continued emergence of the pracademic, which is fantastic, because I think if we solely have applied sports psychologists out there doing the applied work with a lack of research, of course the profession will come to a standstill, and that's not healthy, not good. If we have an overarching number of researchers that are purely researching with no sense of the landscape out there, again, it's of little use, really. So I think the more we can keep connecting those dots, the better.
Yeah. Yeah. I see that within clinical psychology as well. Sometimes it feels,
Mm.
excuse me, like the researchers, are a bit too removed from
Yeah.
sometimes the messiness and complexity of everyday practice.
Yeah.
Last but one question. If you could give any advice to people interested in becoming psychologists, what would that be?
I think it would be, explore where the interest comes from and really sort of hold back from thinking that there is a map to becoming a psychologist. That, in terms of the qualification route, there is a map, there's a clear map,
Mm-hmm.
isn't there? But in terms of, whether you then become a psychologist and work in the, applied setting for 20, 30, 40 years or not, just hold back on an expectation that you will or won't, and actually just understand that the process of doing your degree, your postgrad, your clinical training in itself is absolutely invaluable, and the end result may be that you become a psychologist, it may not, but my advice would be just to enjoy that, because it's less about a map. I guess it's more about a compass and a direction for where you're headed. And as long as you check yourself against that direction,
Yeah,
in a direction that feels like it's right for you,
yeah.
keep going with it.
I love that. And I think that's something that for a lot of people, we don't realise how much of our own stuff pulls us towards
Mhm.
psychology kind of careers. And then at some point there's a like, oh, as we start to understand some of those connections. So I think I love that as a piece of advice. So people are curious about that. They might not, particularly sort of the younger you are, the less sense you might have of that, but to be curious about it from the get-go, that there is this interaction between what we're interested in and perhaps meeting some of our own unmet needs, exploring things, finding things that we need, as well as being able to use things with athletes, with clients that we work with.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, love that. Thank you. And then my very last question, is there anything I haven't asked you about that you'd like to share when you think about your journey, your career?
Oh my goodness, what have you not asked me? Hmm. You've not asked me where I see myself. I appreciate this isn't an interview for a job, by the way,
Oh, you've got the job. I've given you the job already.
but you haven't asked me where I see myself in 5 to 10 years' time, and I'm glad.
Okay.
If you were to ask me, I would give you what some might think is a very fluffy answer, because I don't work with a map. I work with a compass. I know that people, performance, human interaction, connection, and developing people is my absolute passion. The shape in which that takes and the shape that will be in 5 years or 10 years' time, I've no idea.
I love that. Yeah, I find that very relatable as well. One of the things I love about being a psychologist is that we can do different things, that it is such a flexible career path. And we can mosey along. We might be thinking we're going in one direction, and then a really interesting idea comes along and takes us over here, and
Yeah,
then we see where that leads.
I agree.
Thank you for that. I'm going to
Thank
stop
you
recording now,
very much.
if I can remember how to find the button.